Hello, my name is Keisha Head, and I am the founder of Project 360 Degrees, which is an organization that provides support to survivors of sex trafficking who have been formerly incarcerated. I wish I could be there to give this presentation to you in person, but unfortunately I can't. So I decided to make this video so that I can give my insight into the world of sex trafficking. Apart from being a daughter, a mother, a wife, a sister, I am also a survivor of child sex trafficking. And I want to give you a little insight into my history and how I was lured, groomed, and trapped into the world of trafficking. So I want to begin by giving a quote from the President Johnson. Um, and I love this quote because it really gives paints a picture of the era in which I was born into. I was born in 1980, and in the 80s, the Black community, took a turn, I would say, for the worse. We were on the heels of the civil rights era. The civil rights era, our grandparents who fought so hard for equality. And so after that, the Black family went through some sort of breakdown, and we saw the effects of that definitely in the 80s, especially on the beginning stages of the crack epidemic. So, doing this speech is not a popular speech because President Johnson was ridiculed a lot because he refused to accept the fact that there was a system in place that was systemic and also that kept people of color oppressed. And he was blaming it on the breakdown of the family structure, not really understanding that the system was designed to break the Black family unit down. Um, so the quote is, Negro poverty is not white poverty. The breakdown of the Negro family structure, which he said was the consequences of ancient brutality, past injustice, and present prejudice. When the family collapses, it is the children that are usually damaged. Johnson continued, when it happens on a massive scale, the community itself is crippled. So during this time, Johnson did an assessment of the Black community. The welfare reform was in full effect, and 70% during this time, 70% of Black children were born to single parents. So I was one of those children. My mom was, I would say, the product of multi-generational poverty, and so was I. I fell in line in that continuum. My mom was the 13th child out of 13, and I was the fifth child out of six. My mother, she didn't continue her education because she began to have children very young, and she also battled with mental illness, and it affected the way that she was able to care for us. So ultimately, because of the breakdown within the mental illness community and the lack of support given to those who suffer with mental illness, all of my mother children were taken from her and placed into care. So it's safe to say I was born into care. Um, Five of my siblings had already been removed from the home. At the age of two, due to neglect and other things, my mother lost custody of me and another a brother. We were placed with my aunt. A lot of times, we navigate throughout life and we don't understand the effects that certain systems have on people. And that was the case with my family. Um, Being born in an era that transcended the civil rights movement, there was a divide within the Black community. Some people continued their education, ended up getting nice jobs and thriving in life, and you have some that took the other route that went into the government's housing and got on welfare. And also, there was a divide where in the Black community where those who had pursued their education began to look down on those who um, chose to be on government assistance for whatever reasons. And that was the case in my family. So I have a divide in my family. I have some family members that are educated and well to do, and I have some family members that just generational have been dependent on the government. And there has been a breakdown in that family structure. My mom, for one, being on government assistance, there were strict regulations that restricted you from having males in the household. So that system in place, everyone in the projects that I knew um, did not have fathers. Father, we didn't even know. I don't even know who my father is. So from my very first experience of being in a household, I only saw my mother, and my mother struggled very. My mother struggled a lot trying to care and provide for her children, and due to her mental illness, at some point she had just a breakdown. And so, when I look back over my life and to see where the exploitation began, I would have to say that my exploitation began in foster care at 2 years old. So, and I say, and I'll elaborate on why I feel that is so. Me and my brother was placed with an aunt, and I don't think that any thought went into who was the best person to care for us. I think that my aunt was willing to take us in, and the only reason that she was willing to take us in was because there was a check associated with us. So that increased her income. She was a recent divorcee. She was struggling to care for her two teenage sons. And when the opportunity came for her to get me and my brother, she was willing, even though I don't think she was equipped or prepared to care for two additional children. During that stint in her household, um, I suffered from, well, me and my brother, I don't know if my brother was sexually abused, but I suffered from sexual abuse, physical abuse, and mental abuse. And that lasted for about 12 years. Well, not 12 years, 10 years. I was with my aunt until I was 12, from 2 to 12 years old. It affected me behavioral wise. I really lashed out in anger because I couldn't understand why my aunt was so mean to me, why my cousins were molesting me, all those things I couldn't really grasp my child mind around. And I didn't understand why, when I told, nothing happened. And I realize now that it wasn't really about us, it was about the assistance. And I really do believe that that played a part. And there's so many children in foster care right now who are being abused. who are being sexually abused, physically abused, and who are targeted simply because of the income that comes along with them. So I want to say that that was the first time that I was sold. Um, it was when I was in care. And I want to paint the framework that led up until the point of me being trafficked. So at the age of 12, I had an interruption of my identity. Before, from the age of 2 to 12, I grew up in a very strict Baptist household. And if any of you out there know Baptist, you can't get more perfect than Baptist. I had no room for error in my upbringing. Very strict. If you sin, you go straight to hell. Like that was ingrained into my subconscious mind. So I tried very hard to be perfect. Um, and it was impossible. It was impossible. I was a child. Things were happening that I um, did not understand why. A lot of things happened to me coming up, but I tried to navigate and I tried to manage, but I had an anger problem. I was very angry and I wanted my mother. I think at the bottom of all of my anger, all of my pain was that need for my mom. So at the age of 12, I had an interruption and my aunt decided that she didn't want to care for me anymore. My brother had already been removed from the home years prior, and so she decided that she didn't want to care for me, and she just packed up all of my clothes and took me to my mom's house, who I had no relationship with because of the. Remember in the beginning, I told you about the breakdown between the some family pursued their education. My aunt was one of the family members that pursued an education. She was a school teacher, and my mom was on government assistance. So she really looked down on my mother. And also, she didn't understand mental illness. She thought it was a demonic possession. So she didn't even want to be around my mom. And so I didn't have a relationship with my mother coming up. Um, and so at 12, she just dropped me off to my mother's house. And I was so afraid. I finally, I was happy and afraid at the same time. I finally had the opportunity to establish a relationship with my mother, something I've always wanted to do. But I did not understand what mental illness was. I learned very quickly that my mom was incapable of caring for herself, better yet, a child. So I had to learn independence. And that was something very new to me because I grew up sheltered. My aunt did everything for me. She clothed me, she fed me. Um, so, in that aspect, I was cared for. There was no neglect. Um, and now I was put into a position where I had to transform my whole way of thinking at 12 years old. And so I began to see the effects of mental illness. And my mom, sometimes she would be gone for weeks at a time. And then my school noticed my attendance um, was declining, and there was a neglect issue going on because I could no longer provide for myself. And so I began to get exploited within the community by adult males. They would notice me lacking food or me lacking things, or they would proposition me with food. They knew my mom was mentally ill. Sometimes she wasn't there. So they really used that opportunity to exploit my vulnerabilities. So that lasted about 6 months. And then I was put into a formal system of care through the child welfare system. And so that was quite an experience. Um, I was exploited all throughout that system of the child welfare system. Um, I remember I ran away once, and I talk about this. I have a foster mom who I've just been in connection with for a very long time, and she told me, she was like, when you ran away and I found, and we kind of linked up, and I took you to your case manager to see how I can become a foster parent. They just gave you to me. They didn't ask for any ID or anything. And the next month, I got $1,000 check in the mail. I was like, wow, that's interesting. You could have been anybody. And I remember just from the age of 12 until the age of 16, I had been through 42 different placements. And to be shuffled about at that rate, life just became unreal to me. Um, I didn't know how to adapt. I developed PTSD because a lot of trauma happened and a lot of things happened during that duration. At the age of 16, I gave birth to my daughter, and unfortunately, I had to give her to her father's side of the family because I was so ill equipped to care for her. So that was additional trauma. Now, not only was I taken from my mom, my child was taken from me. So there was a lot of generational things that were happening. And at the age of 16, I reached out to a childhood friend who I grew up with in church. We reconnected somehow, and I told her at that time I had ran away from a placement, and my case manager had told me that I was at risk of depleting all of my services or resources, and I linked up with a childhood friend. I called her and told her that I was homeless, and she told me that she knew someone who she can introduce me to, so who could help me, and so she introduced me to this guy named Sir Charles, who was a pimp within the community in Atlanta, a community in Atlanta. And I went to meet Sir Charles, and she left me with him. And for the first time in my life, I realized, now looking back, I didn't have any suspicions of trafficking, of slavery. I didn't even know that that world existed. Um, I didn't have any idea that it existed. I was just so naive. I was so desperate, and I was so vulnerable. I was very vulnerable. And Sir Charles knew all of this, and he used the first day of meeting him, I began to tell him everything about me, everything from being born to my schizophrenic mother, growing up with my aunt, going into foster care, ended up having a child, having my child taken, and how I was so hurt and how I wanted to see my child. And he knew everything about me. I even showed him where my godparents stayed. Told him, and he used all of that information to entrap me into trafficking. It took 3 days for me to go from Keisha to a whole entire different being. 3 days, and I was entrapped into the life of prostitution at the age of 16. And Now looking back, not only do I see the setup, how I was set up from a very young age, just from the grooming within my community, I also see that this system has been in place for a very long time. There are children that are being lured into this lifestyle, and everyone profits. It is a $1 billion industry, and we have to start looking at how these systems are affecting culture because everything that even down to music, I can see how it had groomed me into becoming um, property of search houses. Um, the first time that I was sold, it did something to me psychologically. I could not believe that this was happening to me. I could not believe that people in my community did not see me because after this happened, and because when I was trafficked in my community, and people began to get word that I had been involved in this type of lifestyle, and they kind of shunned me, especially my family, my godparents. Everyone treated me as if I had a disease. Um, I lost contact with a lot of people. People wouldn't let me come in their house because they felt that I was so nasty and filthy. I lost my identity, and that to me was very heartbreaking. Um, my friends, even to this day, no one has asked me what happened to me. Everybody know because human trafficking is kind of like a thing now, and there's a lot of awareness going around. But no one has sat down and asked me how did it happen, why it happened, and that's bothersome because it makes me feel like it keeps them at bay from being accountable. Because I feel if someone who had knew me would have reached out to me, I would have had an outlet to escape and get out of that lifestyle. So ultimately, I ended up staying with Sir Charles for a year, and I during that year, it's probably about a year and a half because I turned 18. And at 18, I got away from Sir Charles, but I was very much involved in the lifestyle of prostitution because I couldn't, there came this addiction to the money. I was so afraid of becoming homeless again. So I stayed in the lifestyle because it really was all that I knew. Because at 16, 17, 18, you really are supposed to be developing um, your sense of identity. And I lost that. This was my identity. This was who I was and who I was brainwashed to believe. This was me. I lost all connections with who I was. And so ultimately, at the age of 18, I got my first felony. So I lost all of my citizen rights. I could not get access to housing. I could not get a good job that paid livable wages. And I found myself in this cycle. And I just gave up and just chose to stay in the lifestyle of prostitution. So at the age of 26, I ended up getting in some big trouble, ended up going to prison, and served 3 years. And during those 3 years, I did um, some work. God reestablished in me my identity. He reminded me of who I was. He told me that I was not a prostitute. He did not create me to be a slave. He created me to be a virtuous woman. So I began to heal from some of the things that had happened to me in the past. And I began to reclaim my identity and not subject myself to stigmas that people had associated me with. And I began to walk in that identity and believe that I was more than what society had labeled me as, had created a system to entrap me in. And I broke away from that system and I walked out of prison um, with that identity, that new identity. I am Keisha Head, and I am a mother, I am a daughter, I am a sister, and reclaiming that identity. So I thank you for listening to that, but I want to leave you with some solutions in addressing human trafficking and even to support those who are within a system that is, I would say, that is branding, that is designed to systemically keep them oppressed. Um, I would say that there is a system that is designed to keep people of color oppressed. And in order to dismantle that system, we have to begin to think differently. We have to begin to do things differently. We have to create opportunities for our communities to thrive. We have to create environments that are conducive to healing. I can say that we are a very traumatized people through generational trauma, and there are some things that we just don't understand. But if we look deeper, we can get clarity and to help. Even though you might not have this exact experience, please know that someone you know have experienced trafficking because this is I have seen when I was in it, there were so many children involved in this and being groomed and lured and entrapped into this lifestyle. And how did these traffickers get access to these children? Easy, especially now with the internet. There's easy access. There's a culture that exists that objectifies women, and our children are being groomed by this culture, and it only happens to people of color. Our music grooms us for slavery. Our media grooms us for slavery. We There's a quote that says the black woman is the most disrespected being in existence, and that is so true. And we have to undo that system because we are valuable and we have children that needs to understand their value. And even if they're operating outside of what we believe is correct, we have the power to mentor. We have the power to provide our wisdom, our insight, our clarity. We have to get people in tune with their true identity of who they are and to break away from these systems that are designed to oppress them. And I hope that my story, I left out so much of it in detail, and I really wish that I can give more insight, but I am at the brink of my time. But if you have any questions, please give them to Miss Consuela and I will answer them. And I thank you for listening, and hopefully, the lives that you touch will be impacted by my testimony. And I just thank you for taking the time to listen. Enjoy your day.